the work that you did as part of the completion of your MA thesis, right? So I got really interested in your work because it seems to me crowdfunding research, the economics of participatory media, these are sort of hot topics. They've been intensely relevant, I think, topics during the kind of digital media era for a little while. But the thing that I found so fascinating about your thesis was the way in which it was theorizing the blend of public relations, basically, and artistic production. I think the work that you did, first of all, to create this short film that you can watch on YouTube called The Woodsmen, but also then to kind of like theorize how you were creating the film, right? Like that to me just seemed so kind of pressing and new and interesting. And also, I mean, you know, I'm a fan of the film. I think the grisly beauty of the bark shots in the credits, you know, show the kind of potential of high definition filmmaking, right? Like your awareness of textures throughout the entire film is really beautiful. You know, how did you get to that vision? I guess I could ask you to start if you wanted to like introduce yourself or speak to that at all. That would be cool.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I mean, I'm struggling a bit with self identity and how to introduce myself. So I guess I'll open with that. Just figuring out. I feel like I have many different facets, and it's not easily like encapsulated in one quick introduction, but definitely I would see myself as a creative professional. And so, I mean, the Woodsman, it was collaboration on so many different levels that I think you've touched on. You know, first and foremost, the audience part that we'll talk about, but then also just the group working together. I mean, it was a vision that were 4 sort of key partners in bringing it to life. My husband and myself wrote the script, but then we worked really closely with our cinematographer, Rob, and a lot of those beautiful shots that you talk about was his interpretation then of that shared vision. And our lead actress, Kirst, who's Rob's wife, was also very much, you know, brought in right from the early script drafts. You know, we would sit around a cabin and read them out loud and figure out what was working and what wasn't working and share images of some of those gritty shots. I think we were watching like the True Detective intro and we loved some of that kind of stuff and wanted to bring that into our intro. So there was a lot of sort of shared vision and collaboration happening throughout that that I wanted to look at, but then deciding to open it up to an audience and have them participate in the process. That was really an interesting thing that I think you're right. I think that kind of that research on collaborative filmmaking and crowdfunding is really starting to gain some ground right now. But I think I wanted to bring in the filmmaker's voice and hear not just from me and my team that I worked with, but hear from other filmmakers, you know, what brought them there and how did that experience impact their process.
And that, you know, that aspect of it, that there's such a, you know, diversity of voices in the thesis, that's really, I think, what makes it such a valuable resource. And, you know, that's the thing for me is that, you know, this is research where you're trying to balance being, you know, a filmmaker with being a person like researching filmmaking. And you're also trying to do justice to all of the collaborators that you had involved, these different visions, these maybe competing visions, who knows? Is there, so, you know, when I read your thesis, I got the sense that, and I know you kind of name your methodology, but that there was something sort of cutting edge about the actual methodological approach to like trying to incorporate sociologically perhaps all of these different voices and different accounts, but then also analyze your own self doing this thing that you're right. So like,
Yeah,
is there a name
sure.
for that kind of research that tries to synchronously do the thing that you're also studying? Yeah.
Yeah, sort of. I mean, certainly I was in a unique position, I felt, to conduct this research, and that's what led me to even wanting to do the research. I mean, I'm very self-aware that I probably wouldn't necessarily have been aware of even this, that it was going on as a thing if I wasn't part of it. So I chose autoethnography as part of my methods, and that's because it helped me recognize myself as part of the community of practice that I wanted to study. And I really appreciated that methodology because like I felt like it allowed me to wear my biases on my sleeve, kind of in both communities that I see myself as being part of. I really couldn't set aside the filmmaker part of me in conducting the research any more than I could set aside the academic part of me when I was filmmaking, which probably drove some of my collaborators batty. But so I mean, the autoethnographic reflections on my process allow me to gain some distance from my experience. It wasn't quite as synchronous maybe all the time. I mean, the one experience had happened sort of in the past, and I'd done some reflection on that, which really allowed me to kind of analyze it from both the outside as well as the inside of that experience. Something that I like, Hiwang Chang, one of the autoethnography authors that I was using, she really describes that process as using the researcher's autobiographical data to analyze and interpret their cultural assumptions. And that's kind of how I was really trying to pull apart to pull apart that process and what some of those assumptions were on my part.
Yeah, I mean, we shouldn't assume perhaps that we can't perform creative work, like do creative labor, and then also have a certain kind of critical distance from it, right? Like I think those two things are not mutually exclusive. But I guess the reason I'm curious about it is, and I'm going to be talking to other people who are I think both artists and critics of art in this podcast. But the reason I'm curious about it is that I wonder, as an artist and a researcher, which thing you feel ultimately more attached to. Like when you think back, do you feel more attached in a sense, like almost on an emotional level, to the product that is the Woodsmen, or do you feel like you put more energy and effort and like your soul into the thesis part of it? Does that question kind of make sense to you?
Well, yeah, I mean, it makes sense as a question, but I think it's a hard answer because I think there's part of my heart and my soul in both of them. Certainly, the research process, it was quite an intensive experience and frustrating and hair pulling, just as any artistic creation could be. And I think that's something that's part of my sort of identity crisis on some level, is figuring out, what I am. Am I a researcher or an artist? They do think I identify with both, sometimes more as an artist and sometimes more as an academic. So I'm really not sure that there's a clear, I think I'm also a Gemini. So ask me one day and I'll give you one answer, and then ask me again tomorrow and it'll be different.
Yeah, I mean, maybe we get too hung up on labels to some extent, right? But it ought to be primarily about trying to understand, analyze the actual practice of making art, and that's what you do, right, in the thesis. And this kind of leads into my next question, which is about the main point of departure for the research. This idea that public relations is a very relevant part, especially today, of independent filmmaking. Like you basically argue that you have virtually no choice but to compromise and accept particular kinds of maybe economic constraints as just a practical condition for making your work. Do you, I guess, feel like on again that level of like labeling, whether this takes away the idea of an independent artist? And I mean, like in general, you've kind of gestured to this. Are you resistant of that label of being an indie artist or an avant-garde kind of filmmaker? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's a bit of yes and no. So, I mean, I do think that sometimes there is that idea of independent filmmaker. There's the lone auteur with a singular vision. And I guess I do kind of want to challenge that. But I think, just in my introduction, I also challenge that idea. Filmmaking is already a very inherently collaborative process, and certainly the interviews I conducted with the other filmmakers echo this. It takes a team of incredibly talented people, each bringing something of their own artistic sensibility to the table. And there are compromises in many, if not every, successful film project. I think the popularity of the director's cut on DVDs and iTunes special features really kind of speaks to this compromise that sometimes happens. So I don't think that collaborating is new, but I think there is like a new level of collaboration with the audience because you're bringing in a group of people who don't necessarily fully understand the filmmaking process. But they're excited and they want to see, how the process works. And they also want to see films that aren't just, the typical studio standards. So I think there is still room for, more avant-garde, taking risks. It kind of acts, when you collaborate with the audience, it kind of acts as like a signal jam to that closed loop of the regular studio system that I talk about, which kind of requires filmmakers to already have a body of successful films in order to attain the funding that they need to create successful films and to produce a body of work. So I think that's why filmmakers are jumping at that opportunity. But yeah, I mean, there is a level of concession that needs to be made when you're making art that way. But I think you always have to figure out, are you making art just for you? I think one of my filmmaker interviews said, are you making it just to watch it in your mom's basement? Mm-hmm. Or are you making something that you're intending to share? In which case, I think then you have to consider the recipient in that process.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. Like to me, I could speak to the end of The Woodsmen, right? The end of The Woodsmen is this violent kind of style study that segues into a kind of credit sequence, or you could say post-credit scenes that evoke, I think, Stranger Things with the music to a certain extent, and even perhaps It, right? The It being now, right? The renewed It or the new one. It's now, that's
or whatever.
It's the highest grossing horror film, I guess, of all time now. So you're kind of not stealing, but summoning from these established kind of like mainstream films, but in ways that are perhaps like deliberate fan service, like knowing fan service. And that to me is interesting. Like there's a way in which Netflix in its absence sort of like looms in both your thesis and in The Woodsman. At least, Stranger Things is like the flagship original kind of Netflix series. And I guess I wanted to kind of mention the omission of Netflix from your thesis research, just because I think the absence signifies more than its presence in a way, right? Like Netflix has established this huge production presence in Canada. It's invested a huge amount of money in the creative economy of Canada, but there is still this kind of criticism of a private monopoly having this amount of influence within Canadian popular culture. Why did you snub them? I guess is the question. And then also, why are you also, kind of citing their show with the, credits scene? I don't know if you had any thoughts on that.
Sure. I mean, I would say, I guess for me, the thesis was talking largely about independent filmmakers, and to me that means filmmakers kind of acting outside of the established sort of studio system. I talk a little bit about that studio system, or like the quote unquote Hollywood model, but I don't really specifically list any of these studios either. I feel that Netflix would fit right in with a listing like Warner Brothers and Columbia, Walt Disney. And in Canada, that would probably include like Bell Media, CBC. Those are just as difficult to break into for independent filmmakers as the big Hollywood studios. And I don't really see Netflix as being a champion of independent film. And I'm not sure, even with their investment, that that's what they're trying to represent themselves as either. I mean, they're a business first and foremost, and it's great that they have invested into the Canadian cultural economy, and I think that they absolutely should because they're part of our culture now, and we're referencing them certainly. But really, this investment it's mostly for partnerships with the large Canadian broadcasters, with the establishment. Sure, they'll occasionally buy and distribute an independent film after it's already made, but they're not really going to invest in that independent production process. So Netflix still, I guess, represents that closed loop of access to me. If you're not Martin Scorsese or Adam Sandler, then, it's really Netflix isn't offering anything unique. So, I mean, for the independent filmmaker, Netflix might represent a distribution method at best. At best. And if you don't get to that distribution part of filmmaking until you've actually made your film and found someone who believes in you enough to invest in that production process. So for my research, I was really focused on, all the things that lead up to having a film that you might be interested in, then looking at distribution options. And sure, maybe even some of the filmmakers that I interviewed, I'm sure Netflix would be, on any of our lists as, that would be a great potential distributor. But yeah, I don't really see them as being part of the indie process like crowdfunding has the potential to be. But they're absolutely part of the culture, and they're helping to establish the new genre rules and the new sort of audience psyche, which I think is why we love their programs and B kind of did kind of reference that feel in some of the things that we were doing.
Yeah, it's interesting how you in your answer you really blend the kind of intangible aspects of Netflix and also just the tangible ones, right? Like materially, there's, as you say, like there's not a lot of difference between Netflix and other forms of media monopolies. But then what's weird is like intangibly, culturally, maybe, the emphasis on streaming perhaps has produced an environment that allows for more experimentation. So it's like kind of interesting how these things are kind of working alongside one another. And generally, it underlines the role of, I think, digital media in just changing the landscape to a certain extent, right? Economically and materially. And this just kind of a bit of a self-serving segue in the sense that I wanted to address this theorist that I've been reading, Lee Claire LaBerge, on this idea of like artists occupying what she calls a scene of decommodification, where artists, it's increasingly hard to, I think you're saying, kind of establish yourself, establish a specific kind of reputation or artistic voice. And so, LaBerge says now the artists have this sense of entrepreneurial kind of responsibility where you have to be an investor in yourself who protects your brand, she says, itself in a kind of aestheticized capture of possible future value. So I mean, like this is the scene that she's describing, right? In which artists, she says, have to constantly kind of barter their labor for the, I guess, purpose of establishing a reputation. Are you aware of the pressures, I suppose, of reputation, self-capitalization, as she calls them, or generally, like, do you have comments on this scene of decommodification that requires new strategies of like bartering and collaboration?
Yeah, well, I thought I loved a lot of what she was saying and feel like it does really fit, with my own experience, even though I wasn't looking at it, that way. But I would agree, there's a lot of pressures. First, having to have a self that is marketable in some sense. You've got to be able to distill your intro down, which is, something that I've been struggling with.
Yeah.
You have to shift your focus away from your art and start focusing on your own self-image. And, as an artist, that part of me, even as an academic, I don't want to have to think about my appearance or how I come across or, distilling my bio down to a tagline. I just want to, make something great, whether it's art or research. But, so I think I think that's the biggest pressure of this kind of self-capitalization, because there's a lot of labor inherent in self-promotion and building this personal brand. And this labor, I argue, requires that public relations, and it could be entrepreneurial skills, that you're going to have to learn and then implement. And that means spending time away from the actual creation of art. And I think that's a huge part about what I talk about in my thesis. I want to create awareness for filmmakers as to what this kind of labor looks like, self-promoting, and look for ways that they can try and make the path of entrepreneur less of a divergence, I guess, from their path as an artist. I think, you know, there are certainly times when these paths might go in opposite directions and really pull the filmmaker away from their original focus. So I'd like to help them to find a way to blend that a little better, try to look at the labor of filmmaking a little differently, determining where there is room for collaboration, where self-promotion won't increase the workload, but might actually reduce it. Things like crowdsourcing, which I discuss, which might be a little bit like the bartering system that LaBerge talks about. And the filmmaker, yeah, I mean, sometimes they're bartering with other artists in this crowdsourcing, or sometimes they're bartering with the audience, and they're exchanging for bragging rights or access to the art making process. They're exchanging that for, actual capital sometimes.
Yeah, and this we've kind of been circling around it, but this key thing of crowdsourcing, perhaps we should talk about this, specifically. In your research, this phenomenon of using, various forms of networking, so social media being the kind of primary one, to open up channels and access to money. You talk about how it has specific consequences, of course, on the creative product. Generally speaking, what insights did you glean from thinking about the risks and rewards of, getting money, but also in exchange kind of getting constant feedback? Did that open dialogue mean that you had to make specific sacrifices and so on? Or did you even experience those creative adjustments as sacrifices, right? Or was it more, did you find it a source of inspiration?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are, some sacrifices, but I it is something that I'm trying to look at, and something that I really did look at. And I think that there wouldn't have been any room to offer sacrifices to our audience if it wasn't for the audience in the first place, right? I mean, there were some interesting findings, about how filmmakers who were attempting to make films carried the actual and imagined audience around in their minds throughout the process, and that did impact some of the decisions that they made at specific creative junctures. They're trying to interpret, well, how are these people actually going to react, and these people weren't always, sometimes they were just general fans of the genre, so you're following some of those genre rules that you're aware of, and how audiences react to that, and other times it's really specific people that you're like, okay, they're going to start to comment, what are they going to say, how do I move forward from that? But without them, and without their support, and without their sort of willingness to share this collective vision and contribute financially, then there would be nothing to sacrifice. Like you wouldn't be making anything, actually.
Mm-hmm.
So it's a balancing act, and I know that that's a lot of what I discussed with my participants is, how that shifted their work. For me, there was also sort of a level of guilt and a sense of fealty by all of these filmmakers wanting to give your audience back in worth, what they gave you in money, so that there is sort of a truer sort of capitalistic exchange there. Um, but yeah, if it wasn't for them, then I think we all kind of felt like we wouldn't be making anything in which to have any sacrifices for to begin with. So we'd rather have some sacrifices and make something that we're all still excited about, um, rather than have what we might think of as a perfect artistic
Hmm.
idea in our heads and never see it come to fruition. And oftentimes there were some amazing suggestions that made it better that never would have come out of my head alone. So I needed all those other people to weigh in and come up with some cool new things.
Yeah, to some extent, you could say it takes some of the pressure of creating art out of the equation, right? Like, I can see how it might anyway. Like, you're answerable in a fairly direct way to your fans, your audience, and so that perfectionism you talk about trying to get it perfect, which can sometimes lead to such a paralyzing fear of failure that you don't do anything. That sort of gets short circuited to some extent, right? You know, at least to the extent that you don't feel just adrift, kind of, on an island trying to create something. You're directly connected, and so I guess I wanted to ask, I guess, because it does come up in your thesis, and I wonder actually if it came up in your conversations with other filmmakers. Where does that specific fear of failure come from? Like, failure is important. We're constantly told in creative professions, right? If you have to dare greatly in order to do anything, and you have to be willing to fail. But because there is this entrepreneurial emphasis on cultivating a specific brand, I think fear of failure it can be an overwhelming part of the equation, right? Where if
Mhm.
your art doesn't resonate, there's something about you that isn't like it's not breaking through, right? It's like your brand has collapsed on itself or something. Does collaboration allow you to short circuit that fear of failure, or does it make you more acutely aware of it? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's not something that I overly discussed with my filmmakers, but it is something that I certainly reflected on because my own fear of failure did come up in um, my own reflections on that process. I think you're right. I think fear of failure can be paralyzing, and it can, prevent you from moving forward and trying anything, which is never how art gets created. And so collaborating, I think, gets you to the ledge. It gets
Mm-hmm.
you to the point of no return where you're like, oh, well, now we're all in. Now we're doing this. But then the fear of failure becomes so much more public. It becomes so much more. Um, you realize that there are all kinds of eyes, and you also feel very connected to your partners and to your audience, and you don't want anyone to feel like there's been a failure on any part. So all of a sudden, the onus isn't just on your own failure, but on everybody's failure. So yeah, I mean, I think that in art, every artist feels very wrapped up in art, and it can feel very personal if that's then rejected or seen as a failure. But yeah, in crowdfunding, you're almost kind of setting yourself up to fail on two different levels because you're kind of essentially pitching yourself as the only person qualified to tell this story in this way. And you have to build yourself up and make the whole process public. And that becomes like a very high ledge to be standing on and potentially fall from in front of people, if they decide, you didn't reach where they thought that the project was going. You're kind of failing on that artistic level, and then you're also failing on that marketing level where, but you said that you you could do this. Um, yeah, I think that that's kind of part of it, and then the whole process of art being messy and you're inviting people in to look at, the not pretty stuff. Again, to sort of go back to the Hollywood model where we only see making of featurettes and things like that have been highly polished and they only come out after a final film is available, to open it up in the middle of the process and kind of show people the dog's breakfast that the things can kind of look at and look like in the middle. That can be hard because they might feel like you've lost your vision, even though you feel like, no, this is just a normal part of the process. So that's when it becomes really important for filmmakers to have that clear vision and that clear filter to hear what they're saying and go, okay, I think that's just because what they're looking at right now, but in my head, I know we're still getting to where I said we were going, so I think this will all come out in the wash later. And failure is scary because, we all want to keep making art. Nobody wants to be a one-hit wonder or worse, no hit at all. And failing can mean that you don't get that next chance to do something else.
Yeah. So it perfectly put. I mean, living on the ledge, right? Like, what does it mean to live on that ledge? It can be a very uncomfortable position, of course, but like it's the only place from which to actually generate anything, right? Is to kind of risk it. Thanks so much for that. I guess, the only other question I wanted to ask is, I don't want to take too much of your time, but thank you so much for doing this, is, about film, I guess, in general. Like, there are films that we subjectively consider to be successes, and then there are films that for us are complete flops, right? Do you have favorite films or favorite genres of film? Do you listen to buzz? Like, do you gravitate to films that have a certain amount of buzz around them? Or do you generally try and curate your own stuff? Do you have like eclectic tastes in movies or any just curious.
Yeah, I mean, it's a bit of a mix. I mean, certainly there's like a critical mass, right? And if there's so much buzz, then you're like, well, I have to see this movie.
Yeah.
But that could also be, that buzz is setting that film up as well. And if it doesn't meet what I think, those expectations that have risen for me, then that can be kind of a disappointment. And I would say that my love of film is kind of really eclectic. I mean, I can like a great documentary, a great, indie, and then a huge Hollywood blockbuster that I think, they just really pulled that off, and that was amazing and fun. I think I always have a particular love for horror. I think there's some great storytelling that comes, and a lot of new filmmakers start in that genre, so you can see some cool innovations coming out of it, and it's really fun to watch, and it's so much fun to make. Who doesn't love to spray, your actors with buckets of fake blood? So, I think that's always going to have a sweet spot for me. Somebody's doing something really cool and new in the horror genre, but I like to see a lot of different kinds of film.
Yeah, I kind of agree about horror. Like, even though I'm personally, as a academic, I guess, interested in the representation of violence, and especially violence that tries to get to a place of, simulating the real, right? Even though I'm kind of concerned about the effects of that, I'm also you can't deny, in a way, the power of, I think, particular horror films to remind you just how beautiful a medium film can be. Like, the blend of music and shot framing in a film like It Follows, for example, is just, it's incredible, right? Like, it's just, it's, the thing of beauty. And I guess on that level of just aesthetics, I wonder how it felt to screen The Woodsmen in a public space, which you did for its opening, versus, just posting it on YouTube. Like, do you feel that there's anything to that film purists' perspective that the big screen and a collective experience is the best way to really appreciate the high definition textures of those bark shots in the opening credits? Or are we, forgetting how people watch movies today? Any thoughts on that?
That one's a little bit trickier for me to answer as the filmmaker sitting with the audience. I mean, I don't think AI breathed for the whole time. And then, it was just an amazing experience to hear them laugh or gasp or, whatever at the right moments. Mm-hmm. So for me, like that can't be beat. And having, people comment on the YouTube channel is never going to match that experience. But do I think that they can have a great experience watching it on their own? Absolutely. I think that is something that as filmmakers we need to consider. Are people going to sit around and watch it on their own? Are they going to watch it in groups? And I guess I'm not really a purist that way. I mean, I like to be able to sit at home and watch films, and sometimes they find that rather than it being a collective experience, it can just be a really distracting experience to try and watch it in a theater. And I feel like I'm missing things if, there's motion or commotion in the theater with me. So sometimes, I feel like the better experience can be at home. But certainly, yeah, some of the bigger films are still produced intentionally to first watch, on a big screen. And you're never going to beat that big screen, no matter how big your living room is.
I can't tell you how enough sort of like how grateful I am that you've been, willing to connect with me and think through some of these things. I mean, these are, film is, as I say, like a medium that is, just gorgeous to look at, can be transformative, but we're at sort of this transitional moment in a way where you're seeing, films emerge that do look and feel new, I would say, in some ways, and so, to speak to someone who is producing work, but also trying to theorize how one produces work at this time is like, it's wonderful. So thanks so much.
Thank you. This has been great.